You clicked on this video because somewhere in the back of your mind, something doesn't add up. You keep hearing it on cable news, in congressional hearings, from think tank analysts in expensive suits, that China is isolated, that the world is turning its back on Beijing, that America's alliance network is unmatched and China is standing alone on the wrong side of history. And yet, every time you look at the actual trade data, every time you read about another country signing a deal with China, every time another summit happens that Washington wasn't invited to, you feel it. Something about that narrative is broken. And by the end of this video, you're going to see the numbers that completely demolish the isolation myth. Not opinions, not speculation, hard trade data that most Western media outlets either ignore or deliberately bury. And I'm going to show you why understanding this isn't just about China. It's about whether you've been making decisions, investment decisions, career decisions, even political decisions, based on a map of the world that no longer exists. This isn't another China is rising video. You've seen those. This is different because I'm going to show you the specific mechanism, the actual machinery behind how China quietly built the largest trade network in human history while everyone was busy calling it isolated. And I'll show you why America's real position in global trade is not what you think it is. So let me start with a number that should stop you in your tracks. As of the latest data from the International Monetary Fund and the World Bank, China is the largest trading partner for over 120 countries. Not 100, not around 100. Over 120 individual nations count China as their number one trade partner. The United States, roughly 56. Let that sink in for a second. The country that the Western media calls isolated has more than double the number of primary trade relationships than the country that calls itself the leader of the free world. How is that isolation? In what universe does a country with 120 plus top trading partnerships qualify as being cut off from the global economy? Here's the honest answer. It doesn't. The word isolated isn't a description. It's a strategy. It's a talking point designed to shape perception, not reflect reality. A trade advisor I spoke with in Singapore last year put it to me bluntly. He said the Americans talk about isolation because they're describing the world they want, not the world that exists. And that distinction matters more than most people realize. Let me show you how this happened, because it didn't happen by accident. China's trade dominance didn't appear overnight. It was built through a very deliberate infrastructure-first strategy that most Western policymakers either underestimated or completely misunderstood. While Washington spent the last 2 decades focused on military alliances, security pacts, and sanctions regimes, Beijing was doing something far less dramatic but far more consequential. They were building ports, they were financing railways, they were laying fiber optic cables across 3 continents. The Belt and Road Initiative, love it or hate it, is now the largest infrastructure development program in human history. We're talking about 148 countries that have signed cooperation agreements under BRI. That's nearly 75% of the world's nations. And here's what most analysts get wrong about BRI. They evaluate it like a Western investment fund. They ask, is it profitable? Is it efficient? But that was never the point. The point was connectivity. The point was making China the default economic partner for as many countries as possible. And by that metric, it worked spectacularly. Think about what happens when China builds a port in Sri Lanka, a railway in Kenya, a 5G network in Brazil. It's not just construction, it creates dependency loops, trade flows that naturally orient toward China. The goods move on Chinese-built infrastructure, the data flows through Chinese-built networks, the financing comes from Chinese state banks, and over time, the gravity of that economic relationship becomes almost impossible to reverse. Here's what matters. While Washington was telling the world that China was a threat to be contained, Beijing was offering something most developing nations actually wanted. Not lectures about democracy, not conditions tied to human rights benchmarks. Infrastructure, jobs, market access. And that offer reshaped the global trade map in ways that are only now becoming visible. But this is just the surface layer. What's underneath is even more significant, and it connects to something most people have completely missed about how currency, not just trade, is shifting the entire global power balance. And this is where it gets really interesting, because trade volume alone doesn't tell the full story. What matters just as much is what currency that trade is conducted in. And this is the part that should genuinely concern anyone who still believes the dollar's dominance is untouchable. For decades, the US dollar has been the backbone of global trade. Oil, commodities, manufactured goods, almost everything moved through dollar-denominated transactions. That gave Washington an extraordinary power, the ability to sanction any country, any company, any individual, and effectively cut them off from the global financial system. It was the ultimate weapon, and for a long time it worked. But here's what nobody tells you. Every time the US used that weapon, it sent a message to the rest of the world. Your access to the global economy depends on Washington's approval. And country after country started asking the same quiet question: what if we didn't need the dollar? China heard that question louder than anyone, and they built an answer. In 2015, China launched the Cross-Border Interbank Payment System, CPS. Think of it as China's alternative to SWIFT, the Western-controlled messaging network that underpins almost every international bank transfer on the planet. When CPS launched, it processed a modest amount. Fast forward to 2023, and CPS handled over 123 trillion yuan in transactions. That's roughly $17.8 trillion. The growth rate has been staggering, nearly 25% year over year. A senior currency strategist I sat down with in Hong Kong told me something that stuck with me. She said, the dollar isn't losing its dominance because of what China is doing. It's losing dominance because of what America did to its own credibility. She was talking about the weaponization of SWIFT. She was talking about the freezing of Russian foreign reserves after the Ukraine invasion. She was talking about the signal that's sent to every central bank on earth: your reserves are only yours as long as we say they are. And the reaction has been measurable. In 2023, central bank purchases of gold hit an all-time record, over 1,037 metric tons. Why? Because gold is the one reserve asset that can't be frozen by a foreign government. Countries aren't buying gold because they love shiny metal. They're buying gold because they no longer fully trust the dollar system. That's not my opinion. That's the data. Now, let me connect this back to the isolation myth, because this is where the whole narrative falls apart completely. If China were truly isolated, why are so many countries actively working to trade with Beijing in yuan? Brazil and China agreed to settle trade in their own currencies in 2023. Saudi Arabia has been in active discussions about pricing oil in yuan, a move so significant it even has a name now, the petro yuan. Argentina, Russia, Iran, Pakistan, Bangladesh, even France, yes, France, completed its first LNG trade, settled in yuan last year. Most people think currency is just money, but here's what's really happening. Currency is infrastructure. It's plumbing, and China is building a parallel plumbing system that allows countries to trade without ever touching the dollar. Every country that plugs into that system is one more crack in the foundation of dollar hegemony. If you're finding this valuable, really think about sharing this with someone who still believes the mainstream narrative, because what comes next changes the entire picture. Let's talk about the diplomatic architecture, because trade and currency don't move in a vacuum. They move inside relationships, and China has been building relationships at a pace that would shock most Americans if they actually paid attention. In 2023, China brokered a diplomatic normalization between Saudi Arabia and Iran. Read that again. Two bitter regional rivals with decades of hostility brought together not by Washington, not by the United Nations, by Beijing. That single event should have rewritten every Western assumption about China's global influence. But it barely lasted 2 news cycles in American media. Why does that matter? Because diplomacy creates trust. Trust creates trade agreements. Trade agreements create dependency, and dependency creates alignment. This is not ideology. It's not about communism versus capitalism. It's pure gravitational economics. Countries align with whoever provides the most tangible benefit to their economies. And right now, for most of the developing world, that's not America. Here's the uncomfortable question. When was the last time Washington brokered a major peace deal between 2 countries that didn't involve American strategic interests? When was the last time the US offered a developing nation a no-strings-attached infrastructure loan? The silence is the answer, and that silence is precisely the gap China has been filling with something that goes far deeper than most Western analysts are willing to admit. And what China has been filling that gap with isn't just money or concrete. It's an entirely different model of international engagement, one that doesn't ask countries to choose sides, one that doesn't demand ideological alignment. And that's why it's working so effectively in regions where American influence has been quietly eroding for years. Look at Africa. Not the version of Africa you see in Western headlines, the one framed around aid, poverty, and crisis. Look at Africa the way Beijing sees it, 1.4 billion people, the youngest population on Earth, vast untapped natural resources, and 54 countries that are desperate for infrastructure investment. China is now the largest bilateral lender to African nations. Chinese companies have built over 13,000 kilometers of railway across the continent, over 100,000 kilometers of highway, more than 1,000 bridges, nearly 100 ports. I spoke with a logistics executive in Nairobi 2 years ago. He told me something I've never forgotten. He said, the Americans send us reports about governance. The Chinese send us engineers. That one sentence captures the entire dynamic better than any think tank paper ever could. And it's not just Africa. Look at Southeast Asia. ASEAN, the Association of Southeast Asian Nations, represents 10 countries with a combined GDP of over $3.6 trillion. China became ASEAN's largest trading partner in 2009 and has held that position every single year since. In 2023, bilateral trade between China and ASEAN hit $911.7 billion. That's not a rounding error. That's almost $1 trillion in annual trade with a region that sits right in what the US considers its strategic backyard. Here's what makes people uncomfortable. The United States still thinks of Southeast Asia through a security lens, military bases, freedom of navigation patrols, defense pacts. China thinks of it through an economic lens, supply chains, market access, infrastructure connectivity, and the countries in that region, they overwhelmingly prefer the economic conversation because you can't feed your population with a military alliance, you can't reduce poverty with a naval exercise. Most people think America's alliance system is its greatest strength. But here's what's really happening. Those alliances are increasingly hollow when measured against economic reality. Japan is a US ally. It's also China's largest trading partner in Asia. South Korea hosts American military bases. It also runs a $162 billion annual trade relationship with China. Australia joined AUKUS, the most aggressive anti-China security pact in the Pacific. And yet Australia's economy would crater without Chinese demand for its iron ore, lithium, and natural gas. This is what I call the alignment paradox. Countries are militarily aligned with America, but economically dependent on China. And when push comes to shove, when the bills need to be paid, when the factories need orders, when the export markets need buyers, economics wins every single time. Let me show you the numbers that really matter. In 2023, China's total goods trade reached $5.94 trillion. America's total goods trade was $5.14 trillion. China has now surpassed the United States as the world's largest trading nation, not by a small margin, but by nearly $800 billion. And yet we're told China is isolated. We're told the world is decoupling from Beijing. The data says the exact opposite. Here's the uncomfortable truth that almost nobody in Washington wants to confront. Decoupling isn't happening. What's happening is something far more nuanced and far more damaging to American interests. It's called rerouting. Companies aren't leaving China. They're adding a middle step. They manufacture in China, ship components to Vietnam or Mexico, do minimal processing, and then export to the United States. The trade deficit with China appears to shrink on paper, but the actual dependency on Chinese manufacturing hasn't decreased at all. It's just been disguised. A supply chain analyst at a major consulting firm told me off the record, we tell our clients decoupling is happening because that's what they want to hear. Internally, we know it's rerouting. The dependency is identical. The geography just changed slightly. That's not analysis. That's theater. And this brings us to the most critical dimension of all, the one that determines whether this trade dominance translates into lasting structural power or whether it has a ceiling. Because China isn't just trading more than America, it's trading differently. And that difference is about to reshape who writes the rules of the global economy for the next 50 years. And the difference comes down to something deceptively simple, what China actually trades. Because not all trade is created equal. Selling raw materials is not the same as selling semiconductors. Exporting coffee beans is not the same as exporting electric vehicles. And this is where China's transformation over the last decade has been nothing short of revolutionary. In 2023, China became the world's largest automobile exporter. Not just electric vehicles, all automobiles. They exported 5.22 million vehicles, surpassing Japan for the first time in history. Japan, the country that defined global automotive excellence for half a century, was overtaken by a nation that most Western analysts said couldn't build a competitive car 10 years ago. That's not incremental progress, that's a seismic shift. But it goes deeper than cars. Look at what China is dominating now: solar panels, lithium-ion batteries, wind turbines, 5G telecommunications equipment, commercial drones, advanced steel alloys, shipbuilding. In shipbuilding alone, China now controls over 46.6% of global output by tonnage. South Korea is second at around 27%. The United States doesn't even register as a serious competitor. Here's what this actually means. China isn't just trading more, it's trading up. It has moved from being the world's factory floor for cheap goods to being the world's dominant supplier of advanced industrial products. And that shift changes everything about the isolation narrative. You can isolate a country that sells you t-shirts and plastic toys. You cannot isolate a country that builds your ports, manufactures your solar panels, supplies your batteries, and assembles your telecommunications infrastructure. The dependency runs too deep. Let me pull this together because the picture that emerges is something I call the gravity trap. And it works like this. China builds infrastructure in your country. That infrastructure facilitates trade. That trade is increasingly denominated in yuan. That yuan flows through Chinese financial systems. Your diplomats attend Chinese-led summits. Your central bank diversifies into Chinese bonds and gold. And slowly, steadily, imperceptibly, your economic center of gravity shifts eastward. No one forced you, no one threatened you, it just became the rational economic choice. And that's why the isolation narrative isn't just wrong, it's dangerously misleading. It gives Western populations a false sense of security. It tells them the old order is holding when the foundation is already shifting beneath their feet. So what happens next? 3 scenarios are plausible. First, accelerated fragmentation. The global economy splits into 2 parallel systems: a dollar system centered on the US and its closest allies, a yuan-adjacent system centered on China, the global south, and resource-rich nations. Both function simultaneously, but interoperability between them decreases year by year. This is already happening. Second, reluctant accommodation. Washington eventually recognizes that confrontation is economically suicidal and pivots toward managed competition. Trade continues, tariffs stabilize, but America accepts a diminished role as one of 2 economic anchors rather than the sole center of gravity. This requires political courage that, frankly, neither party in Washington has shown yet. Third, the most disruptive scenario. A financial shock, a bond market crisis, a dollar confidence event, a major commodity supply disruption forces an abrupt repricing of global economic relationships. Countries that delayed diversification away from the dollar find themselves scrambling. Countries already plugged into China's network find themselves insulated. The gravity trap snaps shut. Which scenario plays out depends on decisions being made right now in Beijing, in Washington, in Riyadh, in Brasilia, in New Delhi. But here's what doesn't depend on anyone's decision. The data is already settled. China is not isolated. It is the most connected economy in human history by virtually every measurable metric. Anyone telling you otherwise is either uninformed or has a reason to keep you uninformed. And that brings me to you, because this isn't really about China or America. It's about whether you're going to navigate the next 20 years with an accurate map or a comfortable fantasy. The people who understand these shifts, who see the gravity trap forming, will position themselves on the right side of the most significant economic realignment since Bretton Woods. Everyone else will wake up one day wondering what happened. So here's what I want you to do. Drop a comment below. Tell me this. Which of those 3 scenarios do you think is most likely and why? I read every comment, and the discussions on this channel are better than most analyst briefings I've sat through. If this video made you see something you hadn't seen before, subscribe, because this is what we do here. We look at the world as it actually is, not as someone wants us to believe it is. The map has changed. Make sure you're reading the right one.